All right, time to read the Bible. Tonight's passage comes from Leviticus chapter 19. Now, there are two parts tonight. We'll be reading verses 1 and 2, then we'll be jumping forward to verse 9 to 18. If you don't have a Bible, yes, it's there. All right, Leviticus 19. And then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to all the congregation of the people of Israel, and say to them, you shall be holy, for I, the Lord your God, am holy." And we're going to jump to verse 9. "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings of your harvest. And you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. You shall not steal. You shall not deal falsely. You shall not lie to one another. You shall not swear by my name falsely and profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. You shall not curse the deaf or put a stumbling block before the blind, and you shall fear your God. I am the Lord. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. You shall not go around as a slanderer among the life of your neighbor, for I am the Lord. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord."
Thanks so much for reading the Bible, Brody. It's an awesome passage you just heard. I'm going to pray first, and then we're going to spend some time reflecting on this amazing part of the Bible. Father God, thank you, Lord, for all of the Bible and the way you use it to help us realize how much we need you. Father, I ask that your Spirit would be moving among our hearts, whether we wonder if you're real, whether we know you, and drawing us to Christ. There's so many things, Lord, you know that we all come from a different place. You might sit next to someone in a completely different universe of life, of relationships, of stress. Lord, please help us for our minds to calm and slow and actually hear what you have to say to us. But I ask, Lord, that you would provoke us, that we will become aware of the things that we don't normally pay attention to. We ask that in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, this is one of those passages you don't normally spend time reflecting on or reading and all that jazz. This book, obviously. But the first words that Brody read out, the Lord said, tell the Israelites what? The first thing was be holy. That's our reflection. What's it mean to be holy? This whole section is focused here on that question. And I have an image that might help us in thinking about that. This is from last year. The end of the year, our youth group went to Ostamere Beach, one of our outings. And if you know who that is, it's Emma Cooper and her brother doing some kindly brotherly things, giving her a pizza while she's buried up to here in the sand. It's pretty awesome. She's loving it. And so, actually, by the way, it was a video. We couldn't get the video playing for tonight, but a few minutes later, she gets sand kicked in her head and she goes, "Oh, my head, my head." And her brother goes, "No one cares about your head." It's like, you know how brothers and sisters flip? They do something like this and then they do something like that. Anyway, quite funny. The next image is Malachi. He didn't want to miss out on the action, so he's there loving it. It was like he was there all night. He just loved it. And can you just imagine the sand on the bus? The sand like in every single crevice for those kids buried. It's weird, eh? But like for you and I, you don't need to be buried up to your neck in sand to have the problem, do you? You go to the beach, you hang out, no matter how careful you are, it's all through the car, through your towels, through your clothes, somehow it gets on the soap. And the thing is, it helps us understand holiness because holiness spreads to everything. And if you pay attention to the themes in this book, it might feel intrusive, but holiness is intrusive. Nothing goes untouched, and a little bit like the problem of sand at the beach. I mean, think of the subject matter from chapter 17. What do you do about the spilling of blood? Chapter 18, what do you do about sexual behaviour? What do you do about this chapter, how you treat the poor? Like everything has been elevated to this divine call to be holy. So it's a significant shift. The problem for us is we compartmentalise our faith and our life. Well, I think we do life like a pizza. You sort of break it up. You've got your financial life, your spiritual life, you've got work life, you've got your relational life, your physical life, your recreational time, and you break it up like that. And it's good. Some things are meant to be like that, right? So some of you, your sort of like your universal knowledge of, I don't know, English Soccer League, or your knowledge of Lord of the Rings, or your favourite Netflix thing. You don't always bust that out every time you're at a party. You sort of pick your space, right? You pick your time. You clock off at work. And hopefully you can work out how to leave it behind, right? We would say it's unhealthy today if you're at home obsessing all night about work. So boundaries are important. But we sort of employ those boundaries with God a lot. Oh yeah, I like God for some things. I like his voice in some parts of my life. But you see, it makes us have this false assumption that things like, say, finance and work are unspiritual activities. And it blinds you to the reality that God is interested in every single moment and activity we go through. And so that's sort of what Leviticus is giving us now from chapter 18. So if you go to the beginning, we saw holiness move from the tabernacle, the sort of ritual space, chapter 11 to everyday space, now chapter 18 to all of life space, including how you deal with other nations. So it's gone to how this is worked out in every square inch of life. There is no secular, sacred divide. Everything is sacred. Everything in the end has to be dealt with this perspective. Some scholars break the book in two halves. They say 1 to 16, ritual, and then 17 on, justice. So they're the two basic themes, 1 to 16, ritual and ceremony, right standing with God. And the part of the book we're up to, justice, ethics, and right standing with the earth and people and the nations. So that's sort of where we are in the book. Huge. It's clearly moved from life inside the camp to life outside the camp, right? So that's what our book's doing. We're going to look at the way this is structured before we step into our little passage, because it's in between, it's bracketed as one group. In the language, 18, 19, 20 are like a section, and the Pinnacle's 19, the other two are sort of similar material. So have a look at the first 5 verses, the slide will come up, of chapter 18. And then we're going to look at the last few verses at the end of chapter 20 to see how they're sort of put together. So 18 verse 1, the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the Israelites and say to them, I'm the Lord your God. You must not do as they do in Egypt, where you used to live. And you must not do as they do in the land of Canaan, where I'm bringing you. Do not follow their practices. You must obey my laws and be careful to follow my decrees. I'm the Lord your God. Keep my decrees and laws, for the person who obeys them will live by them. I'm the Lord." So that opening statement, it's not just a list of useless, irrelevant rules. God's not just keeping them busy. It's not people trying to jump through a hoop to get God on their side. That's actually not what's happening. The first phrase, it says there, I am the Lord who? Your God. These people have a former relationship with this God. They're not jumping through hoops to gain one. They already have the favour of that God. See, so here's the thing is, doing the law is not in opposition to faith. The book of James says genuine faith will always show up in righteous actions. That's always together. And so the relationship's huge here, because the highlight from last week of the book, James went to chapter 16 where God says, look, get together once a year. I'm forgiving all of it. Rest, don't work. I'm doing the work. I'm going to wipe the slate clean, give you a fresh start. That's amazing. And so some of what's happening in this whole book, it is answering ancient questions. Ancient cultures were always asking the question, how do we get the gods on our side? How do we get those beings responsible for forces like, crops and rain and food and fertility? How do we get them on our side? They had gods for each one of those things. And this gave an all-new view of the divine. The divine is offering forgiveness. You can know where you stand with the divine. Actually, the divine says, draw near me. The whole book is God speaking to us. It's God reaching out to us saying, draw near in gratitude, draw near in sadness, draw near in confession, draw near in whatever. I want to draw near to you. It's an amazing, it's a groundbreaking picture of God. Now let's whip to the end of this section before we look at our chapter. End of chapter 20, it shouts out back to where we were. Verse 22 of 20, it says, keep all my decrees and laws and follow them. So just shout out to chapter 18, same sort of theme. But listen to what the challenge is, so that the land where I'm bringing you to live may not vomit you out. I mean, that's a huge statement there. Verse 24 says, you'll possess this land, I'll give it to you as an inheritance, a land flowing with milk and honey. I'm the Lord your God who set you apart from other nations. The theme at the end is you're different, you're meant to live different. Basically says, don't live like they used to where you came from. Don't live like they live where you're headed. I want you to live differently. And he gets them to this place called the Promised Land, flowing with milk and honey. And it's cool, except they so severely lose the plot that they actually get vomited out. God uses other nations. The land can't bear their evil and they're vomited out. I mean, it's so bad. You've probably heard if you've been with us for any weeks in this series, this is meant to imitate creation. Everything here is like a recreating a new world order. God saved them out of slavery. This is now a new ordering of the world for people who were slaves. They're meant to make a world it's like a new beginning, a new Eden, but it becomes like a new Egypt. Get what they do. Under Solomon, they make a new temple, get this, to the God who saves from slavery using slave labor. Basically, Solomon was saying, hey, I'm the next Pharaoh in town. How far have they fallen from what they were meant to do? And so you've got to see something profound. When you read the law, I just hope you begin to have a greater gratitude for how much you and I need the law. Because sin destroys, it distorts us. It's not just a problem for God, for the land, for other people. It's actually a problem for us who sin. It actually changes who we're meant to become. It distorts you. I have this next slide. It's a picture. Janelle Longley, we were at a Girls' Brigade camp last year. We drove up north. Sorry, Janelle, I didn't warn you. I got a photo of you up here. Anyway, we get up there, we open up the kitchen as well, and it was rank. Like, the kitchen was so disgusting. We're opening windows, spraying everything, trying to find it. She opens the oven and nearly vomits. And there's an up-close photo of it, the next slide. It's disgusting. It's worse than a science experiment got bad. It used to be chicken. It fell up, the bones fell apart. It was filthy. And so one of the weird things, this is an image that should stick with us. It was meant to be chicken, it's something else. And sin does something, like, you know, when it comes to our life and our choices, the things we consume often start consuming us. Sin actually distorts who you're meant to be. It distorts who you end up becoming. It changes you, not just other people. Have that in mind as you read sections of the Bible called law. It's fundamentally important here. The next slide shows us the whole summary of these chapters. There's two key emphases. Chapter 8, the bracketed ones, 18 and 20, deal with sex. And our chapter deals with justice and poverty. These chapters that deal with sex, it basically reaffirms the biblical sex ethic. There's basically two options of sexual behaviour: abstinence or marriage between a man and a woman. That's the vision in the scriptures. We last year spent some time, quite a number of weeks, dealing with elements of sexuality. And at the end of the year, coming into Christmas, we're also going to do a whole series dealing with the question of what's it mean to live in Australia as a follower of Christ? You know, being a citizen of heaven and Australia. So this is actually one of the topics we're going to be exploring again. So I just wanted you to know, if you're a visitor, we're not sort of sidestepping something significant here, but because there's so much to be gained from all these verses. We haven't got enough time to do everything. So we're looking at chapter 19, very cool. And when you're in chapter 19, I don't know if you noticed some familiar sort of verses that are often back and forth in Christian writing, and people think all sorts of things. There's stuff about tattoos, there's stuff about what clothes you should and shouldn't wear. There's some weird verses there. Just before we step into the passage and what it's really all about, it's good to give you some help in trying to work it through yourself. How do you deal with passages like this? But there's some stuff there, obviously, you're going to do. There's some stuff there, what do I do with it? Maybe and you know for sure, as a Christian, I hope we're teaching something fundamental. Don't ignore any part of the Bible. That's why we're doing Leviticus. Every part of the Bible is relevant to a Christian. It's not irrelevant ever. But how it actually applies to us is the trick. You've got to think that through. Here's some principles that might help. One thing when you're reading a text like this, there'll be some things that are clearly reaffirmed in the New Testament. That makes it easy. So New Testament also says things like don't lie, don't cheat, don't commit adultery. Those sort of passages are easy. You'll see some things here, secondly, that are, you sort of sense they apply to us, but they're in a particular cultural situation. Like they're culturally conditioned. So you're going to hear about day labourers and scales and measures and animals. You mightn't be dealing hands-on with the same cultural issue, but you can sort of sense it's telling me something about generosity. You'll find things to do with the sacrificial system, but we've heard week after week Jesus fulfilled that system. You'll also find things that are meant to be about them being holy, being set apart for God, and some commands will be about being separate, different, contrasting to the nations around them. That just may help you have a sense of how do you deal with some of it. Maybe just a quick jump into 2. You can get so much from just pulling apart every single verse. Have a look at verse 19. Just ask yourself, what would you do with this? 19 verse 19, do not wear clothing woven of 2 kinds of material. What do you do with that today? What would you have to take off right now if that's what you're meant not to do? I mean, what would you have to throw out? All the polyester, whatever. What do you do? Well, it's interesting, just pay attention to what it says first. It says, do not wear that clothing. It doesn't say don't make it, by the way. If you read Exodus 28, the clothes that a priest had to wear was made from multiple fabrics. Wool and linen were brought together in the priestly garments. So actually what this is forbidding is other Israelites dressing up and acting like priests, which is actually an issue at different points in their history. Very interesting, isn't it? So you've got to think it through to understand what it might mean. The second one we might look at is, and obviously what I'm wearing is not contradicting that law at all. I look like a priest, thankfully. And the next one, tattoos. Look at verse 28. Do not cut your bodies for the dead or put tattoo marks on yourselves on the Lord. This is another one that, especially in conservative circles, has been thrown around. You shouldn't get a tattoo, you shouldn't get a tattoo, whatever. I think what's really obvious, Hebrew scholars say this is focusing on pagan practices around death and mourning. Now, the Jewish people, they were always encouraged to mourn when they experienced loss and grief. It's not that they can't mourn, but what is forbidden is imitating pagan practices around deities and death and mourning. So cutting and marking their bodies in ways that reflect their pagan worship is something that you're forbidden to do. But therefore it doesn't actually forbid any other tattoos that don't have those associations. And we've got the end of Revelation, Jesus himself has markings on his own body. So I think if someone was asking me, what do you think about tattoos? I don't think I can use this verse to say you shouldn't get any tattoos, but I'd probably use some wisdom. I'd say, hey, look, they're permanent. It's not like a fad. And they cost a lot and they're pretty painful. And I'd probably say, ask the question, what do they communicate to other people? That's probably the type of things I'd say. But I don't think that passage is saying a Christian today shouldn't be ever putting a tattoo on. I don't think it's saying that. Anyway, we could spend a lot of time there. I just want to give you some thinking around this type of writing, this part of the Bible. But we're going to jump into the main thing. And I don't know if you've noticed it yet, but there's something cool happening in the way it's written, always in Hebrew, that sort of you don't notice in English. Verse 3 and 4 in chapter 19, we're just sticking in chapter 19 now. Verse 3 and 4 talk about respecting your parents, talks about keeping the Sabbath, and then it talks about not making idols. And then it says don't lie, don't cheat. It's basically a showing of the Ten Commandments, isn't it? They all sort of show up bit. But I don't know if you noticed, they're specifically reversed. So it's interesting, it starts with honour your parents, then goes keep the Sabbath, and then goes don't make idols. It's exactly the opposite order. It goes idols, Sabbath, and honour your parents. And actually in the Ten Commandments it says honour your father and your mother. This says honour your mother and your father. It's reversed on purpose, because what it's saying is actually how you live in relationship to people is just as important as how you live in relationship to God. They carry equal importance. And so here's the thing. This verse is probably, this whole section is probably, if you like, salvaging the book for some of you. You probably should clap because we're not talking about blood once. It's pretty cool. The next slide is what the theme is today. Love your neighbour as yourself. That verse 18 is the key idea in this passage. It actually breaks down what love is. And you might think, oh, good, I got it now. Cool. And don't tune out, because this demands more of you than anything else we could be talking about here. It's easier to understand, but it's actually harder to live out by a long shot. I don't know if you think you know what it means to love your neighbour as yourself, but before I read this, I was not aware of how significant this passage is. Jesus quotes this verse more than other verses in the New Testament. You believe that? This is where he got love your neighbour as yourself. Of all books, Leviticus. Now that should salvage the book, right? Jesus quotes it and it's about love. But he says so much about it. He says this is the second great commandment. He says it's more important than burnt offerings and sacrifices. He says there's all the two commandments are love the Lord your God, love your neighbour as yourself. The law and the prophets hang on those two. Paul says in Romans 13, he says all the commands are summed up in this one command, because he says love is the fulfillment of the law. So it's a big deal. The book of James says it's the royal law. And apparently, if you spend time in the book of James, almost everything in this chapter is spelled out in practical terms in the book of James. The book of James is huge in relation to this chapter. So, we're talking about love. And I guess the weird thing is the truth for us is that it's always an ambiguous thing for you and me. Even if it's not romantic, we want language of love to just soar, like love's patient, love's kind, the wedding verses, right? We want it always to be up in the clouds, but it's concrete here. It's weird. I wrote music for my wedding, and one of the passages in one of the songs I wrote had words like this, and I apologise for the singing again. It goes like, you're a gift I can't explain, from the hand of the giver, baby. I'd like to take a lifetime to say I love you. Ooh. Anyway, sorry. Rubbish singing, sorry. But the baby bit, I'm just going to say that wasn't from me. The girl who sang it for us, she added that so it stuck. Mate noise, baby, you know. But you can't throw baby in Leviticus 19. It doesn't work anywhere. Look, verse 9, how about this? Give it a go. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your field or gather the gleanings of your harvest, baby. There's a lot of work needs to be done with that passage, right? See, when we want it to be like that when it's love, but it is so opposite. It's concrete. So whatever you think it means to love your neighbour as yourself, it is concrete. Bruno Mars is right. Love's a verb, love's an action. It's so not what you expect. Holiness is not some monkish life, ethereal state. It is in everyday life. This is how you eat. This is how you talk. This is what you do with your stuff. That is love. It's concrete. And so I wrote here that love is another word for holiness lived out for the sake of others. These two things are meshed here. It's how people who are set apart by God live different lives than the rest of the world. Now, I reckon everyone's heard love your neighbour as yourself. Most people go, yeah, I like that. I like to live that way. It's so interesting. And by the way, let's just throw it out there. The next slide shows you, here are all the things in this passage. It's literally going to nail it down. Love means to be generous, to be truthful, to be merciful, to be fair, and be forgiving. We're going to come back to these 5 things, but see how comprehensive it is already. It deals with your possessions, your words, your actions, your judgments, and your attitudes. There's not much missing there. But what's pretty cool, do you notice how many there are? 5. And this morning I just highlighted the fact that I remember years ago someone saying 5 love languages. Remember the little cute book, 5 love languages? You know, some of you couples have used it, whatever, or failed to use it, whatever. But you know, they're pretty personal to me. You know, what are the physical touch, words of affection, gifts, acts of service, and all that jazz. But it's easy for me, just so you know, I'm all of them. So like, if you tell me I'm great, buy me stuff, give me a hug, hang out, I feel loved. It's always going to work. Now, in the book, the purpose of the book is saying, listen, you operate in a couple, your partner operates in a couple, try to work it out. But the purpose of this passage is if you're a Christian, you do them all. If you're a Christian, you live all five. You don't pick two, you do them all. This is so important to see. It's not the same as that cute book. So here's the thing. We're just going to race through, a couple of minutes on each one, just race through the five and finish the talk. Pretty easy. But these five are probably not what you expect. And what's so cool about the way Hebrew works, it's structured inside the language. So just notice some little sections here. Look at the end of these couplets. Verse 10, notice it ends with, I'm the Lord your God. Go 2 verses down. Verse 12, I'm the Lord your God. Verse 14, it ends with, I'm the Lord. Verse 16 ends with, I'm the Lord. And finally, verse 18, I'm the Lord. You might have noticed it when Brodie was reading, but there's our 5 love languages. There's our 5 concrete expressions of love your neighbour as yourself. And it's structured by ending with that little couplet, I'm the Lord. So we're going to look at those quick. So the first one starts at verse 9. If you love your neighbour as yourself, it involves your possessions. In other words, some of your resources are set aside for people in need. That's part of what it means to love your neighbour actually as yourself. Then the command in verse 9, when you reap the harvest of your land, don't reap to the very edges of the field or gather the gleanings. When you're gathering together like crops in a bunch, you're going to drop stuff that you're meant to leave them on the ground. They're the gleanings, you leave them. And on the edge of the field, you're actually not meant to go all the way to the edge of your property. You're meant to leave a section for people who are in need. That's how you're meant to plan. It applies it to a vineyard. Verse 10, it says, do not go over your vineyard a second time, like and keep picking the grapes or the ones that fell. Leave them. Literally, this is a command to use your possessions for those who don't have what you've got. Isn't it amazing how clear and concrete this command is? Love your neighbour as yourself. It's a head of time decision. Now, the Bible we said this morning, Ruth and Boaz, is the best picture of this. Ruth, she's a widow, she's destitute, a foreigner, she's poor, and Boaz is just over the top generous with his stuff. He says, come, you can take the gleanings. He actually commands his workers, leave them for her. He says, you can eat my bread, you can dip your bread in my wine, you can, all this sort of stuff. He looks after her. I want you to think about what might that look like for us today? It's a little bit like going to the ATM and then just dropping a few notes on the ground and walking off, isn't it? Literally, it's like, what would it look like for you to hold your money a bit looser, and so like you're not holding it tight, you just let it go sometimes. It's very significant because they used to tithe. The Israelites used to prepare money for food for priests and so on. And scholars say when they add up all the tithes, it was in excess of 20% of their income. And then they're commanded this on top. It's very significant. And notice it's not like at the end of the harvest, oh, cool, we've got some left over. We can give it to them or help them. No. You decide at the beginning. It's an ahead of time decision so that poor people benefit from your refusal to maximize your lifestyle. It's very significant. You're commanded to create margin at the beginning. $5 a week. End of the month, you got $20. End of a term, you've got over $100. You've got maybe $200. You can give to whoever. Think of how it might look for you to make some margin at the beginning of the year, at the beginning of a month. Think, what do you do when you get extra money? It's good to think about, what do I do with it? Because love your neighbour as yourself is going to involve you planning not to have it all. Second example is it's about what you say, not just your possessions. If you love your neighbour as yourself, the next little couplet, it's about telling the truth. It's sort of a little bit obvious to us, isn't it? Verse 11 says, don't steal, don't lie, don't deceive one another, don't swear falsely by name and profane the name of the Lord your God. There's 2 settings. It seems to be business and the courtroom. And so just to be quick here, at the end of the chapter, Verse 35, it deals with false scales and weights and measures, the way they would do business. They didn't have regulatory bodies back then. And so you could bring up some scales on a table, weigh some, stuff to give someone, and you could have them tipped in your favour. No one would know how they're going to find out. And it's saying, don't do that. And I guess that one of the principles here is, what would it look like to be a person of your word? What would that actually look like in terms of today? Maybe reflecting on how advertising functions could be helpful. Because there's plenty of things that promise more than they can deliver, don't they? I found a really intriguing ad back in the 1900s, doesn't that sound old? But this is actually a very clever ad. Avis Rentals. They tip their hat to Hertz Rent-A-Car because they're literally saying, they're bigger than us. They're better than us in lots of ways. And their line on there says, when you're not the biggest in rent cars, you have to try harder. What a clever ad. It's actually good because there's some parts of that ad they're not over committing on, right? It's huge. And so people talk about business. They talk about the 3 Ps of business: people, product, and profit. They say there's people you're meant to serve, there's a product you want to make that's excellent, and there's nothing wrong with expanding a business, wanting it to grow and make profit. And the problem comes when you reverse them. You start with profit. Then under that, try to make a product, and then you're not going to be serving people very well. I think for us as Christians, really the principle is starting with principles before the other Ps. The principle of integrity and honesty. So think of that. Apply the principle of integrity and honesty to serving people. Integrity and honesty in making a good product. Integrity and honesty in finding a profit. That's more what's in play here. The other setting is the courtroom. And if you think about, it says in verse 16 later, it talks also about not slandering. In general, you need to realise how significant it was in that day and age to bear false witness. It sort of meant everything. They didn't have all the, wiretapping, all the reconnaissance things we have today. They didn't have that stuff to the same degree we have. We're sort of a bit flippant with what we say. Bearing false witness then can change everything. And so you've got to realise, I think there's a big challenge to us. When are we promising more than we can deliver? And when are we actually overstating things about other people, other organisations, other churches? I think there's something you have to acknowledge here that this brings home to me, is we all need to be willing to be corrected. There's a lot of things we all say that are overstatements, that we're actually trying to promise more than we can deliver, or we're saying things that we know aren't true. Everyone likes a bit of dirt to spread around, or we're saying things we know we actually can't confirm are true. It's very significant because our culture has this thing where you've got so many TV shows that are just loving to dig in everyone's dirt. So love demands that we think about our words, because someone can lose a reputation so quickly, can't they? And it's hard to gain it back. The third example is affecting your actions. Loving your neighbour doesn't just involve your possessions and your words, but your actions. And this is one of the most profound here. Verse 13, it says, "Don't defraud or rob your neighbour. Do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight." The first part of this is dealing with, again, a cultural setting of a day labourer. And it's really, the principle here is paying what you said you'd pay when you said you'd pay it. And it's actually a picture of injustice or oppression for a day labourer. They're very hand-to-mouth people. For them to come, they've worked all day, and now you're not paying them, they're in dire straits. And so it's very significant. It's more about honouring your word. And it's good to distinguish some things. It's not actually, therefore, wrong to earn a profit. That's not oppressive. It's not wrong that an employer may earn more than an employee. What's wrong is not being a person of your word. And I want you to notice, it's structured around the idea of not taking advantage of the weak, the day labourer. Jesus pointed out the day labourers when he said, "Give us today our daily bread." It's the people who would work for a day and they get a denarius for that. And so understand the idea is, do not take advantage of the weak. It's interesting how that happens so often in our settings. Look at verse 14. It says, "Don't curse the deaf or put a stumbling block in front of the blind." This is profound. Don't curse the deaf. Well, who would know if you did? The deaf person wouldn't know, would they? And if you put a stumbling block in front of a blind person, they wouldn't know either, would they? This is very significant. You know, sometimes people justify wrong behaviour by saying, oh, look, they haven't got enough money to challenge this. They can't go through the hassles of the paperwork. Don't worry about it. You know, it says at the end of this little couplet something different to all the others. It says, but fear your God. Why? You don't fear the deaf person, you need to fear God. You don't fear the blind person, you need to fear God. Because God sees and hears everything. And so that's a very significant challenge. Loving your neighbour as yourself. You know, Proverbs 14 says, when you insult the poor, you insult the Lord. When you give to the poor, in chapter 19, you actually give to the Lord. God in the scriptures identifies with the people on the bottom and he hears it all. So in other words, don't pick on people. It's not Christian. Happens all the time. Happens in sporting clubs, happens in the neighbourhood, happens in schools and universities, happens in churches. Don't bully others. It's not Christian. The fourth one, second last one. Loving your neighbour involves your judgments. Verse 15, your personal judgment. It says, don't pervert justice. Do not show partiality to the poor or favouritism to the great, but judge your neighbour fairly. This is really good. It goes on to say, don't go on spreading slander about your people. Do not do anything that endangers your neighbour's life. Find the Lord. There's a whole lot in there. I think just to recognise, going to court now, Campbelltown Court, is a lot different to what it would have been back then. It would be a little bit more like sitting in the room now. You pretty much know everybody, and us trying to deal with a dispute between two parties. And what would you do? You're watching one person make their argument, the other person saying what was unfair. Maybe they didn't pay me on time. They said they'd do this. This person said, well, I said I'd pay you if you do it by this date. And who are you going to go for? Because you have opinions. You size people up. You always go for the underdog. Or you like the upstanding person that works hard. Like, what do you do in those settings where you see it on shows all the time or real life courtroom stuff? You know, who do you favour? I know two old guys, they're not connected to us at all here, who right now are about to face a charge of theft, break and enter. They live in a low rental unit complex. They thought they were trying to be helpful. That's what they say. There's some people who have died in their complex, and they sort of manicure the place, the gardens. They look after folk who are getting older, living on their own. And when someone dies, often community services comes and very quickly wants to use the apartment, throw the stuff away before the family have come. And they said, oh, families have often didn't come in time, and they're stressed about all the things that their parent or had left. So this man died and left the window open, so they get in, help themselves to his stuff and move it all to the community room and lock it up, thinking they're doing a good thing. Families show up, and so who do you think you are? How dare you touch our dad's stuff? We think some money's missing as well, by the way. We're calling the cops. Police go through everything. These guys are facing court. Now, what would you do? The guys are in their 80s. They've hardly got a buck to their name, and they're known as the local Good Samaritans. Do you go to the poor? Do you go to the, You and I have natural biases. The next image is an image of Lady Justice. One's a statue in Australia, the other one's a statue in Hong Kong out front a courthouse. That's Lady Justice. A pair of scales, sword in the other hand, sword of truth, and she's blindfolded because it says justice is blind. Justice is impartial. This is about rendering the right judgment. It's actually more complex, isn't it? It's huge. Our court system doesn't get this right, does it? But this is the ideal. And there's plenty of times where it might defer to the rich and those with greater privilege, but the reality is the principle is a foundation piece for any society. What happens when this breaks down? I mean, people lose confidence about doing anything about wrong, don't they? No one will do anything. I'm not going to say anything about that. And a lot more wrong happens in the world. So speaking the truth and justice are foundational for any society. The last thing, love your neighbour as yourself, is going to affect your attitudes. the last little couplet says, do not seek, verse 17, sorry, do not hate a fellow Israelite in your heart. Rebuke your neighbour frankly so you will not share in their guilt. Do not seek revenge or bear a grudge against anyone among your people, but love your neighbour as yourself. I'm the Lord. I think this is a really obvious connection for us because we're really good right now being nice, being polite, but can often be seething in our heart. And what do you do when that's you? Because it's you some of the time, isn't it? Oh, frustrated with that person, or people who act like that, who dress like that, who smell like that, who live like that. And you go home, you talk about them, you make jokes about them, you seethe inside about them. What do you do about that? It's amazing the direction of the Bible here. It says, rebuke your neighbour frankly, or you'll share in their guilt. Another version says, reason frankly with them. Basically, talk it out. It's great advice. I hope you notice the emphasis, though. It's not just to treat people well, it's to go to the trouble to address your heart attitude towards them. Don't hate them in your heart. And really the question for you is, how would you prefer to be treated if you hurt someone? What do you want other people to do for you? If you did the wrong thing, what do you want? You want them to leave the church? You want them to stab you in the back and get you back? Do you want them to talk about you? Do you want them to always be awkward around you? How would you want someone else to act? You probably want them to come and talk it out with you. Such profound advice. It's usually our attitudes that actually stop us talking anything out. And so I guess the last thing I want to show you is just an image here of, I want you to see something about how we are such bad lovers. I genuinely think we're not good lovers, period. Not because I've been at our church, I just don't think anyone's as good as they think. And frankly, you're not going to actually engage with God in your pride. It's actually in your brokenness and honesty about your need for him that you actually get to engage with God. He says the proud he knows from afar, right? Have a look at that. I think there's a slide there, Josh, that says life under God, and it gives a hierarchy, and it starts with God, and then it's got, see, my spirit, my mind, my thoughts and emotions, then my soul, and the bottom is my body. That's really the hierarchy of the way it's meant to work as a Christian, where God directs the way, and my spirit, which has his spirit dwelling in it, serves God. My mind, with my thoughts and emotions, serve my spirit or my will. And finally, down the bottom, my body is the servant of the lot. But you can be a Christian, and usually, if you go to the next slide, the reverse is true. Usually, it's the exact opposite. Usually, our body's in charge. I want to be very clear. You can be a Christian, but functionally live like this, according to all these 5 issues. What do you do with your possessions and what you say and what you do and your opinions of other people and your heart attitudes? Can I say most of the time, it's all reactive. Most of the time, it's driven by appetite and what we've always done when we meet a person like that, what we've always done when we get a bonus in the pay, what we have always done with the way we think about the world or other people. Most of the time, your body is actually in charge instead of the servant. You realise your body is your little power pack. It's like meant to be the greatest servant in your discipleship to Jesus. Some scholars talking about this chapter say we're meant to body forth God's character. I love that. Body forth, like to embody character of God. And it's such a hard thing, isn't it? See, I bet you thought, woo, no blood, no weird stuff. We're talking about love at last. I love the book. But actually, it actually requires so much more of us, doesn't it? And the reason why I want you to sit here is because our tendency is not to look at the stuff we're not good at. You'd rather go buy another book, start another Bible study, go on a mission trip or a new endeavour or do some different things with your life. Go to the gym. Love flows out of a heart that's deeply affected by the way God's come to them in forgiveness. God's given you what you didn't deserve. It's such a significant life change when you're willing to look at how I don't love well with my stuff, my words, my actions, my thoughts. And receive forgiveness, receive grace, receive the love of God. That's actually where love flows from. Genuine love can start to happen. And so if I've made you all guilty, we all lose. If that's all, you just sit there thinking, oh yeah, I'm crap at this, we lose, really. So I guess I want to encourage you to actually do two things. If you want to love your neighbour as yourself, the first thing I want to encourage you is read the law. Spend time reading the law passages in the Bible. Most of us just think, no. But I want to say, if you want to love your neighbour as yourself, Jesus said, Paul said, love is the fulfillment of the law. Spend time reading the law. It's meant to shape your moral reasoning. It's meant to shape actually your choices. So that we would share our stuff, tell the truth, help the weak, be fair, and talk it out. It's huge. And the second thing, last thing I want to say is, if you want to love your neighbour as yourself, you need to go to the only one who actually kept the law completely. There's only one man who loved his neighbour as himself, who was always generous and truthful and merciful and fair and forgiving. There's only one man who will show mercy towards your pettiness, your selfishness. There's only one man who perfectly fulfilled the justice of God. Jesus is the only one who can actually help us begin to love our neighbour as ourselves by loving you first. Pretty powerful passage, eh? Let's pray, and then we're going to be led in song by our great musicians. You guys can come up if you want while we pray. Father God, we thank you so much for the Bible and the way the most simple idea is beyond us. We ask, Lord, that you would soften our hard hearts, that you would actually humble us here. Father, it's amazing that Jesus would share his riches with us. The reality is, Lord, we're so impoverished in our love. We confess that we are so small-minded when we think about the things that frustrate us, the way we deal with our possessions, our time, our money, our actions, our words. Lord, we ask you to forgive us for actually not loving our neighbour as ourselves. And we ask, Lord, that you would help us actually come to you and literally give you our life. We ask that as we sing, that we will be reflecting, that we recognise, Lord, you continue to speak while we sing. We ask that later in the night tonight, that you will be speaking to our hearts about what it might mean for us to receive your love. I ask that in Jesus' name. Amen.